At 3 a.m., the dogs in the village did not just bark, they screamed.
They screamed like something was standing among the oil palm trees, watching every house, waiting. 7-year-old Ada heard it, and then she heard her name called from outside. Her grandmother had warned her, "Never open that door when the dogs bark at that hour." But that night, curiosity pulled her feet to the floor. What she saw in the moonlight near the coconut trees was not a thief, not an animal, and not something that belongs to this world. If you think this is just a normal village story, keep listening. This is Amos Tales Africa, where the night has secrets and every story begins with a choice. Subscribe now, and let me take you back to the moment it all started. In a small village in Nigeria, far away from big cities and noisy roads, there lived a little girl named Ada. Ada was 7 years old, and she had bright eyes that were always full of questions. She lived with her grandmother, Fatima, who was 68 years old and walked slowly but spoke wisely. Their house was small and made of mud walls with a brown zinc roof that made loud sounds when rain fell on it. Around their house were many tall coconut trees that stretched high into the sky and strong oil palm trees that stood like quiet guards around the village. During the day, the wind would blow gently and move the leaves of the trees, making a soft whispering sound. Birds sang in the morning, goats walked freely, and women cooked outside while talking and laughing. Ada loved her grandmother very much, and her grandmother loved her even more. Every evening, when the sun turned orange and slowly went down behind the trees, Fatima would sit outside with Ada and tell her stories about the old days. Some stories were happy, some were funny, and some were strange. One evening, as the sky grew dark and the air became cool, Fatima's face became serious in a way Ada had never seen before. The wind was blowing slowly and the coconut trees were moving gently above them. Fatima looked at Ada and said in a low voice that sounded different from her normal voice, "Ada, listen to me carefully. If you ever hear dogs barking loudly at exactly 3 o'clock in the night, you must never leave your bedroom. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think, you must stay inside and cover your ears." Ada blinked her eyes and asked, "Grandma, why?" Fatima did not answer immediately. She looked toward the dark trees and then back at Ada. "Some things in this village do not belong to the daytime," she said slowly. "And some things wake up when the clock shows 3. Ada felt a small cold feeling move through her body, but she nodded her head because she trusted her grandmother. That night, when she lay down on her small bed under her thin blanket, she kept thinking about the warning. The village became very quiet as everyone went to sleep. The moon was shining above the coconut trees and everything looked peaceful. But far away in the darkness, something moved between the oil palm trees. And somewhere in the silent night, a dog began to bark. That night, Ada was sleeping peacefully on her small bed while the moon shone softly through the little window of her bedroom. The air was cool, and the leaves of the coconut and oil palm trees outside were moving slowly as if they were whispering secrets to each other. Everything in the village was quiet, and even the goats and chickens were fast asleep. Suddenly, Ada's eyes opened. She did not know why at first, but her heart was beating a little faster than normal. The room was dark, and she could hear the soft sound of her grandmother snoring gently in the next room. Then she heard it. A dog barked. It was not the normal kind of barking that happens in the evening when strangers pass by. This barking was loud and sharp, and it sounded frightened. After one bark came another, and then many more joined in. The sound grew louder and louder until it felt like every dog in the village was barking at the same thing. Ada slowly turned her head toward the small window. The moonlight was still shining, but the shadows outside looked longer and darker than before. She remembered her grandmother's warning very clearly. "If you ever hear dogs barking loudly at exactly 3 o'clock in the night, you must never leave your bedroom." Ada swallowed slowly and looked at the small wall clock that hung near her door. The ticking sound suddenly felt very loud in her ears. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The long hand was pointing straight up. The short hand was pointing at the number 3. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the night. Her heart began to beat harder. She pulled her thin blanket closer to her chin and tried to close her eyes, but the barking did not stop. Instead, it became more serious, like the dogs were not just barking at something small, but at something big and strange. Ada covered her ears with her hands, just like her grandmother told her to do, but even through her hands, she could still hear the barking clearly. It felt like the sound was moving closer to their house. She began to wonder what the dogs were seeing that made them bark like that. Was it a thief hiding between the oil palm trees? Was it a wild animal from the bush? Or was it something else? Her mind was filled with many thoughts, and each thought made her more curious. She tried to remember her grandmother's serious face and the way her voice sounded different that evening. She wanted to obey her grandmother, but her curiosity was growing stronger every second. The barking suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more frightening than the noise. It was a deep, heavy silence that made the night feel thick and strange. Ada could hear her own breathing clearly in the quiet room. Then she heard something else. It was not barking this time. It sounded like slow footsteps moving on dry leaves outside the house. Ada's eyes grew wide as she stared at the door of her bedroom. She felt something pulling her from inside, like a small voice whispering, "Go and see." She sat up slowly on her bed. The moonlight fell softly on the floor, and the shadows from the window bars made lines on the wall that looked like fingers. Ada took a deep breath. She remembered the warning again, but her curiosity was now stronger than her fear. And slowly, very slowly, she moved her feet toward the floor. Ada's small feet touched the cold floor, and a tiny shiver ran through her body as she sat still for a moment, listening carefully to the strange silence outside. The barking had stopped completely, but the quiet felt heavy, like the night itself was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. She could still hear the soft ticking of the wall clock, and each sound made her heart beat faster inside her chest. She looked toward her bedroom door and remembered her grandmother's serious warning again, but the sound of those slow footsteps outside would not leave her mind. It did not sound like the steps of a goat or a dog, and it did not sound like the steps of a person walking normally. The footsteps were slow and careful, as if whatever was moving outside did not want to be seen. Ada slowly stood up from her bed and tiptoed toward the door. Her small hands were shaking, but she tried to be brave because she wanted to know the truth. She gently touched the door handle and turned it very slowly so it would not make any sound. The wooden door opened with a soft creak, and she froze for a moment, afraid her grandmother would wake up. But the house remained quiet. She stepped out of her bedroom and into the small sitting room. The moonlight entered through the open window and made the room look pale and strange. The shadows of the chairs and the table stretched long across the floor, and the air felt colder than before. Ada could smell the faint scent of palm oil and wood smoke from the cooking fire that had been put out earlier in the evening. She walked slowly toward the main door of the house, and each step felt heavier than the one before it. Her ears were listening carefully for any sound, but all she could hear now was the gentle movement of the wind in the coconut trees outside. When she reached the main door, she paused again and placed her small hand on her chest to calm her fast-beating heart. She thought about going back to her room, but the thought of not knowing what was outside felt worse than the fear she was feeling now. With a deep breath, she gently opened the door. The night air touched her face immediately, and it felt cold and fresh. The moon was high in the sky, shining brightly over the village. The coconut trees and oil palm trees stood tall and quiet, but their shadows looked darker and longer than they ever had before. The ground was covered with dry leaves, and they moved softly when the wind passed over them. Ada stepped outside. She looked around carefully and noticed that no dogs were in sight, even though they had been barking loudly just moments before. It was as if they had all disappeared at the same time. The village houses around her were silent, and no lamp was burning anywhere. Then she saw something that made her stop breathing for a second. Near the oil palm trees at the edge of the compound, she noticed a tall, dark shape standing very still. It was not moving, but it was not shaped like a tree either. It looked different, and it seemed to be facing her. Ada's heart pounded loudly as she stared at the shadow, and slowly the dark shape began to move. The dark shape near the oil palm trees did not move like a person and did not move like an animal. It moved slowly, almost like smoke rising from fire, but it stayed tall and straight. Ada's eyes became wide and she felt her legs grow weak, yet she could not run because her body felt frozen in one place. The moonlight was shining brightly, but the shape looked darker than the night around it, as if it was swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. Ada tried to tell herself that maybe it was just the shadow of a tree moving in the wind, but the coconut trees were still and the oil palm trees were not shaking. Everything else was quiet. Then she noticed something else that made her heart beat even faster. Around the dark shape, she could see the village dogs standing at a distance. They were not barking anymore. They were not moving either. Their tails were down and their ears were flat against their heads. They were staring at the tall shadow, just like Ada was staring at it. It was now clear to her that the dogs had not been barking at nothing. They had been barking at this. The dark shape slowly lifted what looked like a long arm, but it did not look like a normal arm. It looked too long and too thin. It stretched toward one of the coconut trees, and when it touched the tree, the leaves began to shake softly, even though there was no wind. Ada felt a cold breeze pass over her face, and the air suddenly felt heavy and hard to breathe. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out of her mouth. She wanted to run back inside the house, but her feet would not move. Then the shape began to turn. It turned slowly, as if it knew she was there. Ada's heart felt like it would jump out of her chest as the shadow faced her fully. She could not see a clear face, but she could see two faint glowing spots where eyes should be. They were not bright like fire, but they were glowing softly like small pieces of charcoal that had not completely died out. The dogs slowly stepped backward, one by one, still not barking, still not making any sound. The dark shape took one slow step forward. The dry leaves on the ground did not make any noise under it, as if the ground itself was afraid. Ada finally felt her body begin to move again, and she slowly stepped backward toward the house, but her eyes never left the glowing spots in the darkness. The shadow took another step forward, and this time Ada heard it whisper her name. Ada. Her breath stopped. The voice did not sound loud, but it sounded close, even though the shape was still near the trees. She shook her head in fear because she did not understand how it knew her name. Then suddenly, all the dogs ran away at once. The glowing eyes became brighter, and the dark shape began to move toward her faster than before. The dark shape moved toward Ada faster than before, but it did not run like a human being and did not jump like an animal. It glided over the ground as if it was floating just above the dry leaves, and yet the leaves did not make any sound under it. Ada felt her heart beating so loudly that she was sure the whole village could hear it, but no one came out of their house, and no door opened anywhere around her. She tried to turn and run back inside, but her legs felt heavy, as if invisible hands were holding her in one place. The glowing eyes were now closer, and the air around her became colder than it had ever been before. She could see her own breath in the night air, even though it was not Harmattan season. The shadow stopped a short distance away from her, near the edge of the compound, where the oil palm trees stood like tall, silent guards. For a moment, everything became very still again. The moonlight dimmed slightly, as if a cloud had covered it, yet there were no clouds in the sky. Then the whisper came again, softer this time but clearer. Ada. The voice did not sound angry, but it did not sound kind either. It sounded empty, like wind passing through a hollow place. Ada finally found her voice, and in a shaking tone she asked, "Who are you?" The dark shape did not answer with words at first. Instead, it slowly lifted its long arm and pointed toward the forest path that led deep into the trees behind the village. Ada's eyes followed the direction of the thin arm, and she suddenly felt a strange pull inside her chest, like something was gently calling her to walk toward that path. Her feet began to move without her telling them to move. One small step, then another. She tried to stop herself, but it felt like her body was no longer fully under her control. The shadow began to glide backward slowly toward the trees, and Ada kept walking forward, following it. The ground felt cold under her feet, and the night seemed darker the closer she moved to the oil palm trees. The houses behind her looked smaller and farther away, even though she had only taken a few steps. Suddenly, she heard a loud voice behind her. Ada. It was her grandmother. The voice was strong and filled with fear. At that same moment, something warm grabbed Ada's hand tightly and pulled her backward with great force. She fell onto the ground near the doorway of the house, and the strange cold feeling around her body disappeared immediately. The dark shape stopped moving. It remained near the trees for a few seconds, and the glowing eyes flickered like a weak flame in the wind. Fatima stood in front of Ada, holding her tightly against her chest. Ada could feel her grandmother's heart beating fast, and she could hear her whispering prayers under her breath. The shadow slowly began to fade. It did not run away. It did not scream. It simply became thinner and thinner until it looked like smoke, and then it disappeared into the darkness between the oil palm trees. The moonlight became bright again. The night air felt normal, but Ada was shaking badly in her grandmother's arms, and Fatima knew that what she had feared for many years had finally tried to take her granddaughter. Fatima held Ada very tightly, as if she was afraid that if she loosened her arms even a little, something might try to pull the child away again. Ada was still shaking, and her small hands were cold like ice. The night was now quiet, and even the wind had stopped moving through the coconut and oil palm trees, as if the whole village was listening. Fatima slowly helped Ada stand up and guided her back into the house. She quickly closed the wooden door and placed a strong wooden bar across it. Then she shut all the windows tightly and covered them with thick cloth. Her face looked serious, and her eyes were filled with fear and sadness at the same time. She carried Ada back into the bedroom and made her sit on the bed. Ada's lips were trembling and her eyes were wide open, still trying to understand what had just happened. Fatima knelt down in front of her and held her small hands gently. "I warned you," Fatima said softly, but her voice was not angry. It was filled with pain. "I told you never to step outside when the dogs bark at that hour." Ada began to cry quietly, not because she was being scolded, but because she finally understood that the warning was real. "Grandma," she whispered, "it called my name." Fatima closed her eyes for a moment, as if she had expected those words. She slowly nodded her head and said, "It always calls the name of the one it wants." Ada's heart skipped a beat when she heard that. She moved closer to her grandmother and asked in a small voice, "What is it?" Fatima sat beside her on the bed and took a deep breath before speaking. "Many years ago, before you were born, there was a story in this village about something that walks only at 3 in the night. It does not belong to the day, and it does not like bright light. It waits for children who are curious and who do not listen to warnings." Ada listened carefully, holding her grandmother's hand tightly. "It cannot enter a house unless someone steps outside to meet it," Fatima continued. "That is why I always told you to stay inside. The dogs can see it before humans can, and that is why they bark." Ada remembered how the dogs had stood still and then run away. She felt another small wave of fear inside her chest. Fatima gently touched Ada's forehead and began to pray quietly. She prayed for protection, for safety, and for peace. As she prayed, Ada slowly began to feel warmer and her shaking started to stop. But something inside Ada had changed. She felt different, as if she had seen something that was not meant for a child to see. The village that once felt simple and safe now felt like it was hiding secrets in the dark corners between the oil palm trees. Before lying down, Fatima looked deeply into Ada's eyes and said, "It tried tonight, but it did not succeed. However, now it knows you stepped outside." Ada swallowed slowly. Outside, far away in the darkness near the forest path, a faint shadow moved once more between the trees. And somewhere in the distance, a single dog gave a soft, lonely bark. Ada did not sleep for the rest of that night. She lay beside her grandmother, listening to every small sound, and each time the wind touched the roof, she held her breath. Fatima stayed awake too, sitting upright and quietly praying until the sky slowly began to change color. When the first light of morning came, the village looked normal again. The coconut trees stood tall and peaceful, and the oil palm trees swayed gently in the soft breeze. Women came outside to sweep their compounds, and children's voices began to fill the air. It felt like nothing strange had happened at all, but inside Ada's heart, everything had changed. She followed her grandmother outside later that morning, and as they stood in the compound, Fatima pointed toward the place near the oil palm trees where the shadow had stood. Ada looked carefully and noticed something unusual. The dry leaves on the ground were arranged in a long, narrow line, as if something had passed over them without touching them fully. There were no footprints, there were no marks, just a strange path where the leaves looked pressed down but not crushed. Fatima took a deep breath and finally told Ada the full truth. Long ago, she began slowly, there was a child in this village who loved to wander at night. He did not listen to warnings, and he always followed strange sounds. One night, he stepped outside when the dogs barked at 3 in the morning. The next day, he was found far inside the forest, weak and silent, and he never spoke again. Ada's eyes filled with fear and sadness as she listened. They say, Fatima continued, that whatever walks at that hour feeds on fear and curiosity. It cannot take someone by force. It must be invited by a step, by a choice, or by a door opened willingly. Ada understood now. The shadow had not pushed her. It had not grabbed her. It had simply called her name and waited for her to come. Fatima gently placed her hands on Ada's shoulders and said, "The world has things we can see and things we cannot see. Wisdom is knowing when to stay away from what calls you in the dark." Ada nodded slowly. She had learned a lesson that night that she would never forget. Curiosity is good when it helps you learn during the day, but curiosity in the dark without wisdom can lead you into danger. From that day forward, whenever the clock ticked toward 3 in the night and dogs began to bark in the distance, Ada stayed in her bedroom with her ears covered, just as she had been told. She no longer felt the strong pull of curiosity because she understood that not every mystery must be solved. Years later, when Ada became older and wiser, she told the story to other children in the village, warning them in the same serious voice her grandmother once used. And deep in the Nigerian village, surrounded by tall coconut trees and strong oil palm trees, the night still comes every day. The dogs still bark sometimes at 3 in the morning, but now the children listen. And so, when the night becomes quiet and the wind begins to move gently through the coconut trees, remember Ada's story. Some sounds are not meant to be followed, some calls in the darkness are not meant to be answered. And sometimes the greatest courage is not stepping forward, but choosing to stay inside. In every village, in every home, there are warnings passed down from those who have seen more than we have. Wisdom listens, curiosity learns, but wisdom always protects. As the moon rises again over the oil palm trees, the lesson remains simple and powerful. Not every mystery is yours to solve. If this story stayed with you, if it made your heart beat faster, if it made you think twice about the quiet of the night, then journey with us again. Subscribe to Amos Tales Africa, like this story, and share it with someone who loves powerful African tales. Because here, every whisper has meaning, and many more stories are waiting to be unfolded.